Okay. So yeah, just make sure you've got your slip of paper. Please make sure your name is on it. So far, this is going to be the third quiz we will actually complete, and everybody's had their name on it so far. Everybody had their name on the exam, which I don't know if that's ever happened in my entire life. That the first 3 assessments that I've given, everybody put their name on. It's fantastic. I thank you for that, and I'm encouraged by it. So please make sure your name is on that slip of paper so we can keep that streak going.
Are the grades for the exam?
Here we go. They are, because I want to give you your exam first. I have your exams to hand back today, and then I'll put the grades up. All right, so here's the quiz. Wow, number 1, that's really confusing. I wrote this morning, and my brain was not working. Just give a phylum of gymnosperms, because it makes it seem like you have to... I mean, you could give a specific example of an organism in that phylum if you want. It'd be kind of fun if you chose the one that only has 1 living species, right? You're like, here's the phylum. Here's the species. Take about another minute. All right, please pass your quizzes to your right. Those of you at the end of the row, if you could just make a neat pile of quizzes, I would appreciate that. Alrighty. So give an example of a phylum of gymnosperms, or give a phylum of gymnosperms. We have Coniferaophyta, we've got Ginkgophyta, we've got Cycadophyta, and then why can't I think of the other last one? Nidophyta. Thank you. I was the silent C, right?
G. G.
G?
Yeah.
GN. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's just... so those are our 4 phyla of gymnosperms. What structures make angiosperms so successful? The flowers and the fruit, right? And we talked about the relationship that they have with insects, that as one increases in diversity, so does the other. Why aren't seed plants restricted to moist environments like seedless plants are? Because the seeds and the pollen resist water loss. So they can store water and keep water. And you could also write that the pollen or the sperm does not need to swim through water. It can be dispersed in other means by the male gametophyte. That is the pollen grain actually moving the sperm to the female gametophyte. All right? Make sense? Okay, so I'm going to hand back your exams right now. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the exams, and then we've got a few points that I want to discuss that relate to the homework that you've been working on and relate directly to seed plants, and thinking through how do we deal with seed plants in the context of just plants as a whole, and how do we think through some of that. So let me give you back your exams. So I'm going to give you back your Scantron and your exam sheet. You're welcome to keep both. If you want to see the key for the Scantron, let me know, and we can make that happen.
For me, we're more familiar with territory now that we're organisms. I was going to give an example of give an example of gymnosperm found gymnosperm is a ginkgo.
So it'll be like that.
I can't think of. Listen, I knew the conifer one.
So I was thinking of Cycadophyta. So I put the dough on the some like Ginkgophyta. That just doesn't sound right. So I'm like Ginkgophyta.
Oh, I haven't. Not since I posted. I should.
I kind of tore you apart.
Uh-oh.
Everyone else is so nice, and then you three are...
We're just having fun with it, you know?
Yeah.
I'm all over the place?
Wait, is that like
Yeah, I gotta protect everybody's, you know...
the
Well, not integrity, but...
I don't miss. Well, I didn't miss them this time. But... Oh wait, I did.
Protect everybody's rights.
Are you the
The
secret?
right to academic anonymity of sorts.
I'm
What's that? Oh, you're new.
Started something.
Oh man, he did not rip me apart. Whatever. He's lying. As for you, Mr. Devon. It's like, so there, take that. But yet,
I want to get it on this now.
What do you guys know about?
oh, just nerdy stuff. I like it because I get to
I'm
be
gonna start reading.
Yeah, you should.
that mean you guys don't agree on the same answers, or you just pretend?
What's that?
So do you guys not agree on like the same answers?
I
Kind
like.
of lean it 50?
I try to know. It's more like you don't explain this correctly and I was thinking about this. You're
It's
just trying to,
talking arguments.
yeah, trying to nitpick their saying like, I'm smarter than you. You know.
That's definitely encouraging.
It's like getting food to the kids in the back seat in that third row. Although I just throw things back to them.
Actually, didn't do that bad.
You? Okay.
I can tell you there's no more satisfying thing in the world than when a child in the third row of a vehicle is asking for something and you throw it to them and hits them right in the face. Right in the face.
All the ones I found, which is all the bacteria. All of them were like,
That should make you all sick in
I was
alphabetic order.
surprised they didn't do better on that. What's that? Oh, you just now looked?
There he is.
He just now got it.
Oh, I don't want it. Here it goes.
I didn't do that well on my red one. I thought it'd be better.
I'm not surprised with these. I didn't know the first one. I didn't write down any. Dang it, if I had just written down the examples, I would have only missed one question. I'm so mad.
I know, I surprised a lot of people.
Actually, I was really scared of this. I feel like I understand. So this next section.
No, you were involved in this. You should go on and check it out.
Did anyone get 100?
No. I mean, you like, so 150 out of 150.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Lots of people got over 100.
Over 100.
Did you see your, well, you haven't seen me read yet?
Actually.
He gets a pat on the back.
Wait, why did you put such a
That's a matador. You know what those are, right? Matadors?
Modern.
Yeah, yeah. So the bull is gonna come gore the guy.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's basically like equestrian.
Yeah, but then I get out of his way. Like, so there. How do you?
I'm surprised you can read them.
Okay, so just a few comments.
You did better than I did.
The exam is out of 150, which you probably noticed since there's a score that says something out of 150 and it's circled. So the way I came to that, and I mentioned this already, but the way it worked is both the multiple choice and the short answer section were worth 50 points. And then whichever section you did better on, I doubled that and then added in the other section to give you a total of 150. So just kind of for a sense of seeing the boundaries, a 135 out of 150 would be a 90%, a 120 out of 150 would be 80%, 105 out of 150 would be a 70%, and then 90 out of 150 would be a 60%. I told you all I would have an answer for you as far as what the overall average is, but I don't yet because I haven't actually entered them in. But the average is somewhere around the mid 70s. I don't know exactly where, but that's where the average is, which is fairly consistent with what the class is year after year. Keep in mind, I've mentioned this already, this is just the first exam. The lowest of your 4 exam scores gets dropped automatically. But if you got something that you are unhappy with, it's probably a good idea to find some time to sit down and meet with me, and we can work through some things. So I've had a request from someone in the class. I offered it to another person. I don't know if they're going to be interested, to give them somebody in the class that they might think about studying with. And so because of FERPA rules and protecting your academic, not necessarily anonymity, but I can't like say, well, I would suggest this person, because then that means I'm telling them that you are doing well. But if you are doing well in this class and you know you're doing well and you're willing to work and study with some people who are struggling, hang out after class is over. And again, if you are not doing as well as you would like in here and you are okay working with another student in the class who's willing to study and help, you can hang out after class ends as well. And then it's something I will offer to you to find a time in our schedules, that is your schedule and my schedule, for us to sit down and to work and to strategize on how we can better prepare you for future exams and for quizzes as well. That being said, there weren't any questions on the exam where like a lot of the class struggled with that question. It was just kind of all spread around, which is usually an indication that there weren't any questions that weren't fair, or just we're asking something that a good chunk of the class wasn't prepared to answer. So everything just seems to be kind of spread out. And so as you and I sit down, which we should if you scored anything you are not happy with, although if you scored, like a 146 and you are unhappy because you wanted a 150, I'll sit down with you, but give me some time, okay? Take it easy for a little bit. But if you scored something that you are unhappy with, and we sit down, I'll figure out what sections are you doing better on, and then from that try to figure out why is it that you are struggling in another section. One thing I really encourage everybody to do, regardless of how well you're doing in this class, when we take our lecture breaks in the middle of class, you really ought to be writing down what you're thinking in regards to that question. When I tell you to take a minute and just think about it, you really ought to be writing down your thoughts. Then as you start talking with those around you, you really ought to be writing down their thoughts and how your thoughts have changed with talking to those around you. And then especially once we come back together and we're all talking about it, and you're hearing from students that weren't sitting in your vicinity, and you're hearing from me kind of giving a summative thought on that, it's a really good idea to write those down. Because a lot of the short answer questions on the exams and even the multiple choice questions come right out of those discussions. Because I really do try to make those discussions really integrating different parts of what the textbook is teaching, what the slides are representing. And so because of that, I feel like our discussions do a really good job of just helping you through the process of not just information literacy, being able to, walk through, your different types of viruses according to Baltimore classification, but to actually take that information and do something with it, right? And those questions, I really try to design them to do that. And because of that, I feel like those are helpful questions. And I really want these exams to not just be an assessment of what you know, but something that actually helps to increase your understanding. And I feel like the way that they're structured does that. I also understand that the way that they're structured can provide frustration, because it's not just, knowing the definitions to some key terms, that it requires some critical thinking. That's not easy. I understand that. So I want to help. I want to, try to encourage those of you that are doing well to think about, spending some time studying with somebody in the class that's not doing as well. And because that only helps you to understand the material even better. So that's all I'm going to say about the exam at this point. We have a couple of questions I want to begin our discussion, and right away, if you haven't been writing down what's going on in our discussions, you really ought to start implementing that as a strategy right now as we spend some time having some discussion summing up chapter 26. Okay, first question. And right off, I don't need you to think about it and jot down your thoughts. Right off, I want you to start talking with those around you. And here's the first question we're going to discuss. Do all plants root back to a common ancestor? And so with this, you know, I don't necessarily want your personal opinion as you think through this question. I want you to provide some data. And then after that, if you want to give like where do you fall based on the data, that's fine. But as you think through this question, you need to have some data. The data should start your discussion. We're in a unique position. Really, regardless of your view of origins, we're in a unique position in that we think it's possible that what God reveals through His Word is actually a historical account, right? And so if you think that's a possibility, then you have a decision that you have to come to based on the data, all right? So do all plants root back to a common ancestor? All right, take a couple of minutes, discuss that with those around you, and then we'll talk about this together.
What if I were to say yes? Just be critical.
So yes, I would then look at you and be like, well, yeah, there's definitely proof, or not proof, but there's things we can use to support that claim that there might have been ancestors. One is the mustard plant, for example. If you take that mustard plant and you breed it a certain way, you can get things like cauliflower, asparagus, certain things like that. You can get many different species that are really different from each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, yes, there could be a common ancestor for plants, but it wouldn't go all the way back to like a single organism. It'd be more like there's different basal plants, and the plants we see now are a stem off of those different basal plants.
So do those basal plants then share a common ancestor? Because, for example, does ferns, how do they relate with mustard?
Yeah.
Can you connect the two?
Well, you have to go back and see what do people think those
right.
basal plants are. Like the first kind of.
Is it a common ancestor for just plants or for all?
For do all plants, yeah, do all plants.
Basically.
But as we hash out this question, I want you to understand something. So if you're going to, well, you ought to, because you got to provide data, right? And when you're talking about common ancestry, those data are going to be morphological features. You know, what does it look like? How is it structured? Fossil record. Genetic makeup, those kinds of data in terms of coming and sitting and thinking and trying to make a decision on the ancestry of a particular group of organisms. But if you're going to take all plants back to a single ancestral plant source, you have to keep in mind where that ancestor would exist in the midst of all of your eukaryotes. Okay? And so this branch is representing just our eukaryotic forms. You can tell that because we're representing that this has a nucleus. Okay? And so if you're going to say all of the cells that have a nucleus, your only option there would be that this represents all of your eukaryotes, right? Prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus. Everything with a nucleus is a eukaryote. It's just kind of a mess. Okay? And so then we've got some of our supergroups. Here we have excavata. Here we have Chrome aviolata. Here we have Archaeplastida. And this is where our plant ancestor would be in this supergroup of eukaryotes. Here we have Rhizaria. Here we have Amoebozoa. Amoebozoa. And then here we have Opisthoconta. Okay, and so if you're going to root all plants back to a single ancestor, that ancestor is going to be in this supergroup of eukaryotes in Archaeplastida. Okay, and then we saw basically a zoom in on this as we talked through plants over the last couple of weeks. And basically you have three groups of organisms in that supergroup. You've got your green algae that are not plant-like. You've got your green algae that are believed to be more plant-like, and then you have your plants. Okay? And other than that polytomy there, what is true about that phylogeny that we saw? What are some of these data that we need to consider as we think through this question?
So we're just saying like with Archaeoplastia, there's no like polytomy. Right?
Yeah, there's a polytomy right at the beginning. So if we do this, we have our star here representing this branch, Archaeoplastida.
Okay.
We've got this. So we've got Chlorophyta, Charophyta, and Embryophyta. And these are our plants. So we've got a polytomy right there, but what was true about the rest of the phylogeny in explaining our different plant groups? Yeah, there weren't any other polytomies. Okay? Everything was a nice clean branch from one group or one lineage into two lineages, which is exactly what you want to see in a phylogeny because it's an indication that you have a decent idea on what each of the branching events represents an ancestor. You have a decent idea of what that ancestor would look like. It does not mean that ancestor, that we have some kind of a remnant or an example of it. In many cases, we have nothing in the fossil record to support that ancestor ever existed. It's just, if that ancestor existed, this is what it would look like because all of your breaks are clean. Okay, so our phylogeny for plants, other than at the very beginning, looks very clean. Okay, so if you're going to ask the question, do plants actually come from green algae? The data as far as the phylogeny is concerned would suggest that they do not, because you've got that polytomy right at the beginning without any idea of what that ancestor would even look like. Okay? So your phylogeny would suggest that plants do not share ancestry with green algae because it's not neat, it's not clean. Okay? It's still unresolved. Now, could we get to a point where this resolves and we actually we lose that polytomy? Sure. Okay, is it possible that could happen? Yes. Okay, so just based on the data from our phylogeny, it's clean. Okay, our plant data are clean. Okay, so now we have to start talking about other data, right? The fossil record. And I heard from Dr. McLean that he got bogged down talking with you all a lot about the fossil record of plants. He's passionate about the fossil record. Not necessarily of plants, but I'm sure he enjoyed that as well. But he's very passionate about the fossil record. So let's think about the data there. Do the data in the fossil record, what data are there? Let's start there. What data do we have from the fossil record? When do plants first show up in the fossil record? So in the Paleozoic, is that what you said? So in the Paleozoic, let's get a little bit more specific than that. So yes, plants first appear in the fossil record in the Paleozoic. That is true. Silurian. Silurian's when you first start to get actual specimens, actual fossil plants, is in the Silurian. However, we mentioned this before, when would plants have to have shown up if what you're looking at in the fossil record is actually a historical count of hundreds of millions of years of Earth history? They would have to show up in the one previous to that. So they first show up in the Silurian, but your non-vascular plants would have had to have originated in the Ordovician. But there's no fossil evidence of that, right? Okay, those are some additional important data. Okay, just based on their phylogeny, the original plant would have had to have appeared out of green algae in the Ordovician, but there's no fossil evidence of that. First plants show up in the Silurian. Okay, what else did Dr. McLean talk to you about the fossil record? Some of those other data, because I know our textbook does not emphasize the fossil record a whole bunch. Okay, there are other textbooks, and this is why for your homework question this week, and I asked you to talk about angiosperm diversity compared to gymnosperm, and I told you you're probably going to have to go beyond the text because I really wanted you to get into the fossil record, and the textbook doesn't do that. Not many of you did, and that's okay, but we're going to do that today. So when plants, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So trying to get these errors down for the fossil record. So Ordovician.
Periods, not eras.
Periods.
Yeah.
Periods. So they have the Ordovician.
Silurian.
Silurian.
Yep.
So you're saying in the Silurian we have vascular plants.
Yes.
And so we would need to have non-vascular plants in the Ordovician.
You also have, so yes, you have seedless plants, your ferns in the Silurian. You do have some what look like non-vascular plants in the Silurian as well, but not very many. And so the argument is that non-vascular plants are not going to preserve as well, and that's why you don't actually find record of them in the Ordovician, even though that's where they should have. Yeah, yeah, right. Yep. Okay, so let me tell you this, and this is not something that the textbook illustrated, it's not something we've talked about yet, but to allow you to be more fully informed. Once plants show up, it's more than just a single type of plant. It's not like you get to somewhere in the fossil record and you get one seedless plant and then it starts to slowly diversify. Once plants show up, you have a whole bunch of groups of plants with a lot of diversity. So once plants show up in the Silurian, your seedless plants, once those show up in the Silurian, you have a whole bunch of them, okay, without really a lot of evidence of where they came from. You get similar to what you get at the very beginning. What's the first period of the Paleozoic era called? Cambrian. You have what's called the Cambrian Explosion. I did mention that you just get a lot of forms of life showing up all at the same time. You get a plant explosion in the Silurian and in the next period, which is what? The Devonian. Okay, so in the Silurian, you get a plant explosion, a bunch of seedless plants showing up at the same time, okay, without really any indication of where they came from. So the phylogeny looks good, okay? The data from the phylogeny, you're like, okay, it's clean, right? We could make predictions on what that ancestor would look like. The fossil record, it's tough, okay? The data from the fossil record suggests that a whole bunch of different types of plants show up all at the same time. Okay? And so when you get into the Silurian, you get a whole bunch of seedless plants show up in the Silurian. When you get to the Devonian, you get a whole bunch of seed plants show up all at the same time. Okay? And a whole bunch of more groups of seedless plants show up in the Devonian all at the same time.
So could this be more of an example of how evolution works versus an argument against it, where you have something that evolves a form and then that quickly takes root and it quickly evolves and then it normalizes and doesn't evolve as quickly, and then there's another change, it evolves very quickly so that it doesn't get well recorded.
Right. So that's one idea on that's called punctuated equilibrium, that evolution, major evolutionary events happen in short periods of time in very restricted areas. It is not the dominant view on the way evolution tends to happen because it's not what we see going on now. So it's not the dominant view on the way evolution happens.
What's going on now?
So the way we see evolution, that is the appearance of new species happening now, is it's not just like, boom, you go from one species into a whole bunch, taking root in a bunch of different places. Like, that's not the way we see speciation happen. There's occasionally, you get a radiation event where, one species becomes a bunch, but it's very rare. Most of the time you see, and we'll get into this when we talk about the mechanisms of evolution, but that's not the way we see it happen, okay? And so it's a bit uncomfortable, actually, when you've got this happening in the fossil record, okay? So the fossil record, there are some of your data. A whole bunch of plant groups showing up all at the same time in the Silurian and in the Devonian. Now, something we did talk about is that angiosperm diversity increases in the Triassic at the same time that you see a lot of insects showing up in the fossil record, right? And we use that as some of our explanation of the relationship between angiosperms and insects. Yeah.
Angiosperms came in the Cretaceous, I thought. Is that right?
So angiosperms, like pollen. So the first fossilized pollen from angiosperms shows up in the Cretaceous.
So they didn't produce reproduce. They did not evolve in the Cretaceous, but they just
That's an interesting question. The fossil record for angiosperms is very confusing. It's very weird, regardless of what your view of origins is. Because there's individual plants in the Cretaceous that look like angiosperms. Now, is it possible that they're gymnosperms? Sure, but they look like angiosperms. Now, we do have groups of gymnosperms, the netophytes, that do look like angiosperms. They have leaves like angiosperms. Their pollen doesn't look anything like angiosperms, but their leaves do. So is it possible that those have been misclassified? Sure, but you have plants in the Triassic that look like angiosperms, but you don't start finding angiosperm pollen until the Cretaceous, which is like, in case you haven't kind of sorted all this out, it's like 100+ million years after.
But we do see diversification of insects during the Triassic. Which
Yes,
indicates
absolutely.
That there probably were angiosperms during the Triassic.
Yes. Yep. Being that there's a very dynamic and intimate relationship between insects and angiosperms. Yeah.
So you said the plant diversity kind of blows up in the Silurian.
Yep.
The same way with the angiosperms, are they just like all of a sudden they're there, or do you see more
Yeah.
variety?
No. Yep. Yeah. Once and this is true with any plant group. Is once a plant group starts showing up in the fossil record, there are a bunch of them. Which is interesting. So regardless really of your view of origins, you'd have to really explain why you don't have any remnant before they really start to show up in a large number. It's a conundrum. Okay, it's something that's really hard to explain if the fossil record is representing a gradual shift. Okay, so those are some of our data. The genetic data for plants, we haven't talked much about it, and that's just because it's weird. Plants are very, very strange organisms. Plants can handle having more than 2 copies of the genome, which is very unusual for eukaryotic organisms. Okay, every cell in our body besides sex cells have 2 copies of the genome, and that's the norm, and they function normally. Plants can have 3, 4, 5, 100 copies of the genome, and it doesn't seem to bother them. Plants have huge amounts of lateral gene transfer, where like one plant gets genetic material from another plant through a virus, and it doesn't seem to change the way they function all that much. So plant genetics is just strange, very strange. So we won't talk a whole lot of about those data. So when you're left with this, you have data from the fossil record that suggests that the answer to this question is no, that plants do not share a common ancestor. Because if they did, the fossil record should look cleaner. You would expect it to look cleaner. You wouldn't expect to see so many times where a whole bunch of different plants show up all at the same time. A bunch of different groups with a lot of diversity and not a lot of understanding of why these things work. When you look at the phylogeny of plants, how would you want to answer this question? Yes. Okay, the phylogeny of plants looks pretty good and pretty clean. And then I'll give you some additional data. So there are groups of researchers that do work on various groups of organisms that look for evidence of discontinuity. When you can look in their structure and you can see evidence of where it looks like there's a limit to what you can accomplish, to what you can actually diversify based on processes of natural selection and other processes of genetic change. We'll talk about that when we talk about mechanisms of evolution, but there's a branch of science that looks for these evidence that doesn't come with the assumption that everything shares a common ancestor, which is how you tend to approach taxonomy and how you tend to approach systematics. You assume that everyone shares a common ancestor, and then you try to figure out what that ancestor would look like. Okay? There's a branch of science that deals with, okay, well, what if we don't assume that all plants share a common ancestor? Where are there evidences of discontinuity, where it looks like there's a limit to what diversification is actually possible? And what you find is it looks like there are literally tens of thousands of different groups of plants that do not blend well with other groups of plants. That there's an enormous amount of evidence to suggest that there are different discrete groups of plants that do not share ancestry with other groups. Yeah?
So I was noticing when I was reading the text that some of the like phylums,
Phyla.
the phyla,
Yeah.
some of the phyla are like categorized like, okay, this is a common ancestor, but then some of them are like, oh yeah, this phylum doesn't have a common ancestor, but they're grouped together for this reason. So if like the purpose of the taxonomy, obviously from the evolutionary perspective, to demonstrate common ancestry, then why do they have these five?
No, that's a good question. So you've got two issues. You've got two issues at work there. One is the desire to only have groups that represent the evolutionary history, right? So that's one driving force, right? Only have phyla if they make sense because they represent the evolutionary trajectory. Then you have another thrust or move, if you will, that says no, like use groups that make sense, that somebody can look at and say, yeah, that's a real biological group, right? And so you have basically what's come up in this term that's called a grade. And so a grade is a group of organisms that make their living in similar ways. Another term for this is a guild. And so you even have this in human groups, right? You've got like the Screen Actors Guild, right? The Musicians Guild, okay? And so this is basically a group of organisms that makes their living in similar ways. And so this is kind of a balance to like, hey, no, let's only have phyla that actually represent the evolutionary trajectory. Yeah. And then you've got this reality of like, no, like this is a real biological entity. It makes sense, right? And so you kind of have competing ideas of how taxonomy should be done. And so what you end up getting is you get some phyla that it's like, yeah, these are a really good group representing, you know, if there is some kind of evolutionary trajectory, this is what it is. And then you have other phyla that don't really fit that mold because it's not, you know, that's not always helpful. And it's like, so you have this issue, and we'll talk about this a lot in animals because it comes up a lot in animals. Okay. So to call something a reptile. So that group reptiles, it's not a real group according to the believed evolutionary trajectory. But it's like, no, I can say reptile and I know exactly what comes to mind, right? It's like something that's scaly, kind of gross because it only has one opening that it poops and pees and reproduces out of, right? And then it's like, yeah, like you can say reptile and I know what you're talking about, right? So it's like, there's something real about that. Like that's a real biological reality. And so we can't just stop using reptile because it doesn't match what's the believed evolutionary trajectory.
Within guilds and grades, is that a place where there's a lot of convergent evolution?
Sure, yeah. Some of it may be because of convergent evolution, but most of them, yeah, I mean, some of them are that way. So you'll have like seed eaters. Mm-hmm. So you'll have like a guild of seed-eating birds, right? And yeah, a lot of times it's because of convergence.
So not just to be clear, maybe you already said this, but within a guild, those organisms don't necessarily share a common.
Correct, and that's what he's getting at there with the question that Joseph asked is like, well, why do we have some of these phyla where it says not all the members of this phylum share a common ancestor, right? Yeah.
So is the term grade kind of like a gradual transition? Because you could think of like ginkgos are sort of like gymnosperms, but they have qualities of angiosperms and their leaves are method like deciduous. I don't know.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I mean, sometimes. Yeah, it depends on kind of the specific group. It's kind of like a group by group what's going on in this grade. And then grades and guilds can be really small. Like you could just say seed-eating birds. That would be a really, exclusive group. It's like, man, how many seed-eating birds are there that live in Southern California? There are actually a lot. But it's a pretty exclusive group. Whereas if your guild is like decomposers, right? Now you've got like a much wider guild or grade. So much more inclusive group. Okay? So do all plants root back to a common ancestor? This is one that's a little bit interesting. So in terms of like how should we think about this according to what Scripture presents about origins? Because Scripture doesn't talk a lot about plants other than plants as like food and a provision for the other parts of God's creation. So it's kind of interesting. Biblically, you can make an argument that plants are not living organisms. They aren't said to have the breath of life. That's something that God provides, right? A living characteristic. And the Greek philosophers honed in on this. And so the Greek philosophers talk a lot about souls as well. And they talk about basically three souls. The vegetative soul, the animal soul, and the human soul. Okay, and so humans, we have all three. Animals have two, the vegetative soul and the animal soul. And then plants, they only have the vegetative soul. So like there's something still that separates plants and animals. And we'll get into that, like what is that biologically? But it's just like Scripture kind of treats them that way as a unique group. So it doesn't talk a lot about this. And so it's a little bit difficult to answer this question from Scripture. Like, is it a problem to have all plants rooting back to a single ancestor? I would say scripturally, no, it's not a problem. But when you look at the data, yeah, you've got some big problems. Fossil record doesn't make sense. When you actually look at limits of what you can accomplish inside of a single group from a single ancestor, there are a lot of evidences of separate, unique groups among plants. So there are a lot of issues biologically to this. Biblically, is it an issue? I don't know. Yeah.
I was just, because I was thinking about it, like, so like in Genesis 1, God tells him, he's like, I give you every plant yielding seed that's on the face of the earth. And then in Genesis 9, after the flood, he says, I give you every green plant. And so there's a distinction between originally God just gave them fruit to eat.
Right.
And after the flood, when he gave them animals, he also gave them vegetables.
Gave them other things as well. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, obviously, so they were already, but one thing you can pick up on there is already there was, in early Hebrew culture, there was a way of organizing plants, right? According to things that made biological sense, right? Seed-bearing plants separated from, this bigger group of just all green plants.
So would that be relevant? I mean, what he just said is kind of interesting because most people put the flood boundary right at the Cretaceous.
Yeah,
Paleo?
Permian.
No.
Oh, Cretaceous.
I can't remember the other one. Paleogene? No.
Yeah, Paleogene.
Is this Paleo? Okay. They put the KPG boundary right there.
Uh-huh.
That correlates with the diversification of gymnosperms.
Angiosperms.
Angiosperms.
Yep.
Angiosperms produce fruit.
Yep.
Before the Cretaceous, it was mostly gymnosperms, which did not produce a lot of fruit. So
right.
maybe specified fruit is because that's a new thing now. Are these fruiting plants? Which asks the question, what were people eating before the flood? Were they eating a bunch of
Well, I think what you'd still have is you still have fruit-bearing plants. If what Genesis teaches is actually historical, before the flood, people were eating fruit. So you have fruit-bearing plants.
Well,
The question is, how extensive are the ranges of those fruit-bearing plants? Are they restricted just to the garden?
Right. Okay.
Because if they are, it makes sense why you don't start to see pollen from them until the very end of what represents the flood, if there are very few angiosperms around prior to that. And you have, anyways, we'll talk about all this. Yeah. So do all plants root back to a common ancestor? Probably not, but there is some evidence to support that they may. Let's actually skip this next one. Well, you can think about this next one as you're thinking about you can think about this one as you're thinking about number 3. We're gonna not talk a ton about number 2, but we're gonna focus in on number 3. Did angiosperms evolve from gymnosperms? Okay, so now we've got a group. Both of these are groups of seed plants. Angiosperms have fruit and flowers. Gymnosperms do not, but they both have pollen and seeds. Right, 2 characteristics that allows them to be less restricted in their range. And so you have this question, okay, so do all plants root back to a common ancestor? Doesn't look like, right? There's some issues, maybe, but it looks like there's some real issues. Well, what about just angiosperms from gymnosperms? Okay, so go ahead and start immediately talking with those around you, coming back to the fossil record. And again, do yourself a favor, jot down these ideas. Even if you're like, I don't feel like I contribute anything to this discussion at this point, that's okay. Write down what other people are saying.
So it almost sounds like the diversification of angiosperms are not quite as explosive as the gymnosperms. Because we see what appears to be angiosperms in the Triassic, which I don't know about that. But you don't actually see them take root until Cretaceous, and then obviously the world after the Cretaceous.
Yes.
So they do seem to fit as far as that's concerned. Evolution models of these. The next question is what about polygyny?
Well, so you basically have three spawns. Phyla, so you have Or you have the 4, I
That's
guess.
the extent.
Huh?
That was the extent.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's always fun when like you ask a question like
As well, I would have to go back and look because I don't remember them. I never really studied paleobotany. I'm going to embarrass myself. I don't know.
intriguing questions, and that's it.
But it does seem like the diversification is like slower.
I always like the one. It's like I'm not going to waste your time by writing an answer. So then you actually wrote an answer, right? You still wrote something that you read.
Gymnosperms are seeds. They both have seeds. They both
No, it's
have
fine.
similar
All right.
reproductive strategies.
We're in crunch time. We're down to like, I don't know, like 90 seconds left in our class today. So I want to give you some pieces of information as you think through this question. This is a really important question to think through. So this is where like the genetics actually helps out a little bit. So here's the thing. This you should write down. Angiosperms appear in the fossil record after gymnosperms. Okay? They appear in the fossil record after gymnosperms. You're like, cool, right? I know you love it. I get it. Just calm down a little bit. Your enthusiasm may annoy people, okay? Be aware of your surroundings. 2 is angiosperms have more complex seeds than gymnosperms do. Oh, yeah. Okay? And so they appear later in the fossil record. They have more complex seeds than gymnosperms. And I will tell you this. In a gene that basically codes for how do these plants absorb light, angiosperms have the ability to function in dim light, whereas gymnosperms do not. Angiosperms have the ability to thrive and function in dim light, whereas gymnosperms do not. So we've got a group of organisms, appears later in the fossil record, has more complexity in the structure that allows them to be less restricted to moist environments, and they can better harness dim light than gymnosperms can. All right? So be thinking about that as you continue to think through this question. All right, we are out of time. Again, I made an offer earlier. If you are struggling and you want to kind of stick around to see if there's somebody that would be willing to study with you, and if you are doing well in the class and you are willing to stick around and maybe study with somebody that that is not doing as well, go ahead and hang out.
So the fossil record of Antarctica, Cretaceous,
Oh,
were there a lot of angiosperms and gymnosperms?
that's it. I mean, there's a lot of angiosperm pollen in Antarctica in the Cretaceous period. Whether there are actual fossilized remains of the trees, I don't know. Once you get into the Cretaceous, you find angiosperm pollen literally everywhere.
Okay.
Everywhere. Every continent, ocean deposits. I mean, just everywhere you can imagine, you find angiosperm pollen in the Cretaceous.
Okay.
Now, do you actually find plant individuals in Antarctica from the Cretaceous? I don't know. I don't know if we even... Yeah, we definitely have... I don't even know if you can access Cretaceous rocks in Antarctica.
Oh, you can. Dinosaurs have been found, or early Cretaceous at least.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean, there's a ton of Cenozoic rocks that we can access in Antarctica. So
Yeah.
everything like Paleogene on, we have a ton of stuff from Antarctica.
Yeah.
So if I get freaking the same thing as
Yeah. I want to stick around. I don't like how.
like I got 3 points taken.
I don't like my score, but I do want to.
Have studied, we had 3 points to
It was mine. No, it wasn't.
It's bigger. It's just like 120 out of 100. It's not like, but it's just low B.
Well, yeah. So I'd have to. I can tell you the reason why you lost 3 is because you have to make some mention of not just that they're harder to remove, but that they're also harder to kill.
It's Jurassic, not Cretaceous.
Right? And so it's not just a matter of being harder to remove; they're also harder to kill.
Okay.
And so unless you mention that, there's something missing from your response. So if I didn't take 3 points off from somebody else because I didn't notice that they were missing that, I would hate to look at their exam and then to go back and say, oh, now I need to take 3 points off. But I can tell you why you had those 3 points missing, because it's more than just being hard to remove. Right? You have to make some mention of it. Okay, so hey Nathan, how's it going? Mo, Anna, or Anna, Anna. Always uncertain, right? So if you hung around because you are doing well in the class and you want to study with somebody, or you're willing to study with somebody that's not doing as well, you can find yourself, somebody over there to help to work with and to study with. So, and then vice versa. So you might want to declare yourself as hey, I'm doing pretty well and I'm willing to study.
I would like to study if you doing well or doing
If you want to declare yourself, yeah.
doing well.
Yeah, I feel like you definitely have a comfort with working through the material.
And there are late Cretaceous rocks in Antarctica.
That's it, late Cretaceous?
No, there's Jurassic too, but here's a Moses that was found in Antarctica.
Okay.
It's 66 million year old rock. They did have
Okay, so you do have some Mesozoic rocks.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, you definitely have.
Yeah, all of the deposits from Antarctica that I care about are
Have you ever watched?
marsupial.
I didn't even hear about the Cenozoic stuff. Have you ever watched Walking with Dinosaurs, that BBC program?
Yeah.
They had a whole episode about Antarctic dinosaurs.
Okay.
There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Hello. Yeah.
What should I remember from organismic biology for the MCAT?
For the MCAT, I mean, some of the comparative groups is helpful, but
Not a whole lot.
no, and that's why we put organismic as kind of that first semester, because it's really to just get you to start to think, getting a little bit into the molecular. But for MCAT,
Cells really important, obviously.
yeah, and so your life science section doesn't. I mean, occasionally you'll get a passage that'll talk about a group of living organisms, but really all of the questions are molecular questions.
Okay.
They're cell and they're biochem questions,
Right.
but it's sandwiched in an organism. So I think that the most helpful thing from organismic, the most helpful thing to just remember, because honestly a lot of people forget this, is that cells don't exist as separate entities. I mean, there are single-celled organisms, but a lot of what we talk about, what we study, and what we think about with regards to cell biology is those cells sandwiched in an entire organism that has specific requirements and constraints and things like that. So, I mean, it's really just kind of a frame of mind. Why? Because did you look at this and you're like, man,
It's been a while.
that's just gone.
Yeah.
Gone.
Review it a little bit.
Yeah, howdy. So I heard that Prof. K stopped you in the middle of your exam to teach you something he never taught you. Oh, yeah. How was that?
Very
Yeah.
typical.